Hey guys, this is Mr. Scott. We're going to go over chapter 12 now, which is mainly our terrestrial diversity chapter, and we're going to be talking about mainly about endangered species and invasive species. So, as with every chapter, we have a case study that we can talk about. In this chapter, the case study is on the passenger pigeon, and the passenger pigeon, once again here on the left, is an example of a species that was very abundant in the United States and now is extinct. Another example that we may want to talk about is the great auk. The great auk is a penguin type animal that was very, very abundant in Nova Scotia all the way over to Iceland, and in Europe, and it became extinct in the late 1800s. It was mainly became, what probably made it become extinct was researchers trying to capture a specimen before they went extinct. Another example, well, we've all heard of the dodo bird, but also the dusky seaside sparrow. One of the reasons why the dusky seaside sparrow became extinct was because it lived in Florida. And it lived in Florida near where they built the Kennedy Space Center. And because of the draining of wetlands for farming and also because of the space system, it is now extinct. So I put a little space shuttle there. And so it says some species have become prematurely extinct largely because of human activities, mostly habitat destruction and overhunting. So if you don't remember anything else, you remember that it's, the loss of habitat is the #1 species eliminator. Okay, your learning log, I gave you that in class and on the handouts. One thing to be aware of is here's a picture from the textbook that we use of a passenger pigeon in a museum, of course. The actual date of the extinction of the passenger pigeon is well known because it happened, if I'm not mistaken, on September 1st, 1914 with the death of the last known surviving passenger pigeon. Her name was, I believe, Martha, and she was in the Cincinnati Zoo. And this is actually a picture of Martha after she had died and been stuffed, of course. She's made her way around the world, and now, as a matter of fact, the Museum of Natural History in New York City actually is hosting an exhibit about species that have become extinct. I think recently, or within the last few decades. And so if you're in New York City, you might want to be able to go see that. Okay, here's a short little video clip I want to show you, and so take a look at this.
Martha is special because she was the last passenger pigeon in existence. She died in September of 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo and was shipped to the Smithsonian in a big block of ice by railroad. This extinction was kind of special because it was very extraordinary, because at one point there were billions and billions of these birds in North America, and to have such a mass extinction was pretty remarkable. In the 1860s they were still fairly plentiful. Before that there were billions. Audubon and other naturalists wrote of standing in one spot and having passenger pigeons fly over them nonstop for like 3 or 4 days, sometimes up to 7 days. The passenger pigeon went extinct primarily due to habitat loss and commercial harvesting of the birds for food, for protein, to feed livestock. And the railroads provided a cheap and economical way and rapid way at the time to transport the birds that they harvested to the major metropolitan areas, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, D.C., where they were used as a food supply.
Okay, so here's another little video clip. This was actually made a few years ago by these two gentlemen that were trying to draw attention to just how rapid a population can fall, and it was really because of their efforts that actually a documentary was made, and this exhibit at the Museum of Natural History is now happening.
Let's imagine a flock that's a mile wide and 200 miles long, and the front birds are coming down to glean from the field, and the next in front, and imagine being ahead of this crashing wave of biology working its way up the center of the continent.
There were hundreds of millions, billions of these birds.
That may have been the largest avian species that ever lived.
And we lost it from billions to none in a matter of a few decades.
It was us. We're the ones who made that happen.
Unlike the extinction of most species, the passenger pigeon's death was pretty well marked. There was an individual with a name that was called Martha. It was September 1st, 1914. This abundant bird ceased to exist.
Let's remember what we once had and use that as a way to think about today and to think about tomorrow.
The passenger pigeon touches on so many elements of things that I care deeply about. I care about that this continent has changed. What was here in biological treasure is almost beyond comprehension. What Audubon described is a great example.
The continued buzz of wings had a tendency to lull my senses. The pigeons passed in undiminished number and continued to do so for 3 days.
The average person today wants to not only know the story and tug on the heartstrings a little bit, but what can I do? How can I get involved? And how does it apply to me?
As a cautionary tale to the proposition, no matter how common something is, if we're not careful with it, we can lose it.
And we really wanted to say, hey, look, what can we do to bring to life this story of the passenger pigeon and get kids to be more aware of the history of what happened back in the late 1800s, but also what's going on today, and make those connections from yesterday to today and moving forward.
Why preserve nature and animals and plants?
Well, we and nature are sort of one. We work together, and if there's no nature, there's no us.
I'm particularly interested in shark populations. Sharks are declining because we're hunting them faster than they can reproduce, particularly since the shark fin trade has gained global reach.
2014 marks the centenary, 100 years after Martha died.
The driving force is now humanity, changing the forces of nature. And one of the consequences of the way that we are driving everything on the planet is that we are driving so many of the other species, our fellow inhabitants of spaceship Earth, we're driving them to extinction. We're doing the same thing to our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren that our ancestors did to us, and we don't have the same excuse of ignorance that they did.
So there you see a nice introduction or a history of the passenger pigeon. Here are some notes for you, and you should either have these on your handout or you can get them right now or go to the website. But as they mentioned in the video clip, these flocks of pigeons were obviously found in staggering numbers. And so now if you were to think about what birds do you see in large numbers, especially this time of year or when they're beginning to migrate, you're seeing the European starling, which is a non-native species. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And so when you see birds in these kind of numbers, it would be hard to imagine, wow, we're going to get rid of them. But you got to remember, population growth, habitat destruction, all of these, and then if they have an instrumental value, if they have an economic value, then we're going to make money on that. And so in the 1800s, it was big business. And one of the ways in which they would catch these pigeons is they would use a stool pigeon. And you may have heard about what a stool pigeon is, if not, ask someone. That they would basically sew the eyes shut of the pigeon and attach it to a perch to draw in other pigeons as they would pass by. Like I said, the last known living specimen, the pigeon in the Cincinnati Zoo went extinct September 1st, 1914. Once again, mainly due to population growth, habitat loss, urbanization, loss of forests. And another term that the book doesn't use is masting, M-A-S-T-I-N-G. Masting is really when, if you have an oak tree in your yard, and one year you find that there are a lot more acorns in the yard than there were in the years past, or if you have any type of nut tree. There are years in which they will produce more seeds and years in which they produce less seeds. The years in which they produce more seeds is called a masting event. And because the birds would basically migrate and move from where one area to the next based upon where the food source was, it became quite easy to determine where they were going. They were used for fertilizer. They were used for food. If you eat pigeon, you may or may not know what we call that. It's called squab. Once again, they've been killed by burning grass or sulfur beneath their roosts. They would suffocate and then fall down. And then, of course, feathers for pillows or feathers for feather beds. And now, one thing to be aware about that is it's going to take a whole lot of pigeons to produce enough feathers for one feather mattress. Okay, so why do we find people trading in endangered or threatened species? And we'll talk more about what the difference is in threatened and endangered is momentarily. But one of the main reasons why people trade in endangered or threatened species is because of poverty. Remember that poverty is a factor that makes people do things to survive. And so if it says elimination of exotic and non-native species would increase biodiversity, which of the species are most at risk? Something that you definitely need to remember are the top pet competitors. Your apex predators, the organisms at the top of the food chain, are generally the first to go. Okay, so here's some of the outline notes from your chapter. We basically have 3 levels of extinction. We have local extinction, we have ecological extinction, and biological extinction, or as I like to call it, going, gone. And so local extinction is when an animal no longer exists in an area that it once inhabited, but it can be found somewhere else. Ecological extinction is when the number of members of a particular species, their numbers are so low that they no longer function to fulfill their ecological role in the biological community. So their appearance in an ecosystem is not functioning in the role at which it evolved to do. And so when you begin to see this ecological extinction, you're going to also most likely see other organisms in trouble as well, because we understand that all things are interconnected and interrelated. And then, of course, the most extreme form of extinction is, of course, biological extinction, when a species no longer exists on Earth. We find that many species become ecologically extinct recently. In recent history, we began to raise them in captivity and things like that. And so they're ecologically extinct, but they might not be biologically extinct. So there's your 3 levels of extinction: local, ecological, or biological. Okay, so endangered and threatened. So, of course, most of you are probably aware that the most threatened organisms are your endangered species. Now, it depends upon what literature or what organization you're looking at. If you're looking at the U.S. Categorization of endangered and threatened species, we basically have 2 levels. One is threatened or vulnerable species, where they're still abundant, but because their numbers are going down, they may become endangered in the future. They are monitored, and examples of this is the grizzly and the American alligator. They are considered threatened species. If you look at endangered species, this is when the numbers are so few that they could soon become extinct in all or part of their natural range. 2 of the classic examples in the United States of this are the California condor and the whooping crane. Both of these organisms have been raised in captivity with some success. If you've seen anything on a lot of your National Geographic Channel and things like that, you'll see where they've been raising the California condors, and they feed them with puppets so that they will not imprint on humans. Whooping cranes, they use ultralight airplane to help them to learn to migrate. Now, in that particular instance, those organisms do imprint with humans, and so that's something that you could be of a concern. Once again, the first to go are the big, slow, tasty ones. That actual quote came from E.O. Wilson. He often said that it's the big, slow, tasty ones that are first to go, the ones who have valuable parts that can be sold. Blue whales were in decline for many, many decades, and now we think that their numbers are actually coming back. When your book was published, their prediction is that the blue whales would become extinct, but over the last couple of years, we've actually seen more spottings, or a greater number of spottings of blue whale in the last couple decades. The passenger pigeon represents a loss of natural capital. Remember at the beginning of the year we talked about natural capital, ecological services, so we need to make sure we keep that in our vocabulary. And primarily they disappear because of overhunting and habitat destruction, and both of those are directly attributed to man and human activities. And okay. Now, let's talk a little bit, but here's a nice review for you about extinction. We've already talked about extinction. We've talked about background extinction, so I want to refresh your memory on that. Remember that there is a normal rate of background extinction that we can quantify before our existence, and it was basically 1 species per million species per year go extinct. And we know that that rate is now much, much higher than normal background extinction since we came on the scene. We also talked about mass depletions. Once again, extinction spasm. This is another term that the author uses here that I don't really use very much, but extinction spasm is when you sort of have a burst of extinctions with a large number of loss in a few centuries. And the reason the author speaks to that is because generally extinctions, predicting when extinctions are occurring, have always been very difficult. Number one, because we're having to look at history of rocks, of fossils and things like that. But also it takes usually a long, long time for extinctions to occur. And so in a human time frame, extinctions are occurring very slowly. But in a geologic time, they can occur, they're really occurring quite quickly in the scope of geologic time. Another reason why extinctions are hard to or predicting extinctions are difficult is because a small percentage of the world's species have been identified. We've only identified about 1.8 million species, and there may be anywhere from 4 to 100 million species on Earth. And remember, most of those species will become extinct and we'll never know they existed. And 99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct now as well. Another thing is we know very little about the world's identified species. There's still a lot for us to learn. One approach to estimate extinction rates is to study records from the past. As I said, we can look at how much area a species has. If you look at letter C, define the species, increase the size of the area. We know that the species area effect from Edward O. Wilson's theory of island biogeography. The larger area we have, the greater diversity that we will see, the lower the extinction rate, and the higher the immigration rate. And this will benefit, of course, your species that need large ranges, and those typically tend to be the ones at the top of the food chain. If you look at D, it says when area decreases by 90%, 50% of the species there will become extinct. And so we know that there is a direct relationship between the size of the habitat and the amount of biodiversity. One of the organizations that we need to be very familiar with, the textbook calls it the World Conservation Union. It's actually the IUCN, and you need to know this. It's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They're the international authority on endangered species. Their list of endangered species is called the Red List, and you should know that, okay? And I'll show you a video clip that they released just a year or so ago. Many scientists can use models to estimate extinction risk by predicting the population size, the changes in the habitat or the availability of habitat, and the types of species interactions. It says estimates of future extinction vary due to different assumptions about the total number of species and the proportion found in tropics, rate of clearing of the tropics. This is a big problem. We know that the tropical areas contain the greatest biodiversity as far as on land. And we also know that this is where the greatest deforestation is occurring. And anyone that understands this understands that this is a big problem. Okay, so here's a video clip I got off of YouTube to show you about their list, the IUCN's most endangered species list.
Hi, welcome to SourceFed. I'm Joe Beretta.
Hi, I'm Steve Zaragoza.
What do you think happens when 8,000 scientists from all over the world use together all the knowledge contained within their super genius craniums? Wrong. I'll tell you what happens. They create the first ever list of the 100 most endangered species on the planet. This list includes everything spread across 48 countries, animals, fungi, plants, everything that is in serious danger of disappearing forever.
The list was presented to the masses in a report titled Priceless or Worthless at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Conservation Congress.
Woo! Got it.
It's a doozy. Woo! And I tell you what, I bet you haven't heard of most of these species. But that's the whole point. These 8,000 scientists understand that you don't know about any of these things, and to save them, they're gonna have to raise awareness.
Ellen Butcher, co-author of the list, said all the species listed are unique and irreplaceable. If they vanish, no amount of money can bring them back. However, if we take immediate action, we can give them a fighting chance for survival. So what kind of Earth dwellers are we talking about here? Well, how about Tarzan's chameleon? These adorable little lizards are on the brink due to a continuously shrinking rainforest habitat.
And check out the Madagascar suicide palm. This dude produces yellow flowers from 5-meter long stems, and after time literally dies from exhaustion. Kinda sounds like it's driving itself into extinction. But we're not gonna let that happen, dude. No way. The whole point of this list is to make the incredibly dense human population realize that we have a responsibility to protect every species on this rock, even if they don't directly affect humans.
You know, like in a monetary way, or a food way, or a aphrodisiac sort of way, you know, like rhino horns that supposedly make you want to go boom boom. Speaking of rhinos, the Javan and Sumatran rhinos made the list. Only 250 Sumatran rhinos exist in the wild, and Javan rhinos are down to 100 in the world. These animals used to be abundant, and these numbers are heartbreakingly low.
And it's the same with other species like pygmy three-toed sloth. 500 left. Aww. The spoon-billed sandpiper, only 100 breeding pairs. The Chinese crested tern, only 50 mature individuals.
And the Hainan gibbon, only 20 left. The forest coconut, only 10 mature species exist. And the magnolia wolfi, only 5 left in the world.
Ooh.
That is the wrong reaction for what I just said.
I'm sorry, Joe. I'm bad, Stevie.
Moving on. Now, we realize that you haven't heard of a lot of these life forms. We hadn't either. There isn't a lot of info out there on them, but that's just it. The list was created to raise awareness so we don't lose a little bit of our diversity. And personally, I really do think their preservation is our responsibility. You know, because we're at the top of the food chain and we're rocking these huge cognitive, self-aware brains. It's within our abilities as a species to do a little good for the rest of the world.
And we should, because we don't want to see the species on this list go the way of the dodo, or the Japanese river otter, which only days ago was officially declared extinct by the Japanese government. That sucks.
Hard. It sucks hard. Look how adorable that thing was. And no longer is. That's a horrible realization. We don't want to see that happen to any other species. So anyways, you guys, there's going to be a link down in the description to the full list of 100 endangered species. Check it out. And before you leave this page, be sure to comment and let us know what your favorite animal is and why.
Please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and click this annotation to go to sourcefed.com and see every story we've ever done. And the 5 stories of the day. I'm Steve Zaragoza.
I'm Joe Beretta. See you at the next story.
Okay, so I thought that was a really good video. And like I said, the IUCN, if you go to the IUCN's website, you can actually look at or download a brochure of the top 100 most endangered species. And like I said, now we believe that the extinction rate is now 1,000 to 10,000 times normal background extinction rate. So instead of 0.0001% of organisms going extinct on an annual basis, we're seeing 0.1 to 1% of a species extinction. That's a big deal. And another problem is, in several places, these hot zones, these hot spots, as we talked about earlier in another chapter, and we'll talk about it here as well, is that sometimes the extinction rate can be 25 to 50%. So let's take a look at this. And this is, I kind of got ahead of myself. So species loss and biodiversity loss will likely increase primarily because of exponential population growth of the human population. As I told you before, just about everything we talk about can be tied to population growth, human population growth. The hot spots, these areas of diversity where we find high numbers of endemic species, those extinction rates may be 25 to 50%. Now, when we talked about extinction rates, and we talked about mass extinctions. If you'll remember, do you remember what happens after a mass extinction? An adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation can increase biodiversity, if you'll remember, because it fills unfilled niches. The problem with that what we may see now with this, what we consider the 6th great extinction, which is due to human activity, the possible colonization sites for new species may have been eliminated, degraded, are simplified because of human activity, and therefore new species may not be able to arise because of this. This is a big problem that this Earth has not faced in its young history of 4.5 billion years. If our activities are reducing the rate of speciation, there will be a speciation crisis. And if you've ever seen as I like to call it, the documentary WALL-E, you may see where the cockroach is portrayed as a living organism that survived basically the destruction of Earth. And we know that cockroaches and rats and weeds, all of these, what type of strategists? Right, are strategists. Your generalists tend to survive. Ones that have these broad niches that can alter their way of life are the ones that are going to survive. And so the author of the book tells us that we should always practice precaution and use the precautionary principle to prevent a significant loss of genetic, species, ecological, and functional diversity on Earth. So when we talk about protecting biodiversity, we have to remember that we are protecting all four components of biodiversity. If you look at in 2002 or 2004, a panda pelt would sell on the black market for about $100,000. People are paying about $100,000 to shoot a wild a lion. And so we see premature extinctions once again because of human activities. In your book, and also on the website, if you want to look at these, here's a couple pages, a couple of slides here of endangered and threatened species, and I want to go over a couple of them here with you. We know that the giant panda, once again, is endangered, and we need to make sure we know that the name of the giant panda is the giant panda. There are two types of panda, the giant panda and the red panda. Giant panda, of course, the one that eats the bamboo, is endangered. The whooping crane, once again, look at what I wrote up at the top of there. Low reproductive rate and habitat loss. These are two big reasons why the whooping crane is now endangered. You should know that, okay? Take a look at the blue whale. What has made the blue whale prone to extinction? What has made the blue whale endangered and in danger of not coming back? Low reproductive rate, very low reproductive rate. They have a specialized niche. They're baleen whales. They are filter feeders, so they're eating things like krill. They have fixed migratory patterns. So it didn't take long for whalers to realize, if I come to this particular point in the ocean, these whales are going to come through here because they have fixed migratory patterns. So that made it easy for them to pick them off. If you look at the highest rate of mammals at risk for extinction, they are the apes and the monkeys. You should know that. The highest percentage of mammals at risk are the apes and the monkeys. If you look at the grizzly bear, we mentioned already that it is threatened. The African elephant is endangered. The Siberian tiger. Your tiger species and subspecies are disappearing at alarming rates. Their numbers are dwindling greatly. The Arabian oryx and the other types of oryx, we're going to show you. I'm going to show you a great video clip about people in the United States raising these exotic and endangered species, and we'll see what you think about that. Okay, here's a couple things. You notice I got a couple things circled here, very important. We've already talked about the gray wolf, and we talked about the importance of the wolf in its role as a apex predator and its role in the functioning of the ecosystem. We talked about the reintroduction of the wolves to Yellowstone and how important that was at the ecosystem functioning properly, and the revival of the riparian vegetation and the small trees coming back because the wolves keep the elk on the run. Another story that I'm not sure I told you is about the black-footed ferret and the prairie dog. This is an excellent story, which I'll get to in just a minute. But basically, here are two linked species. The main prey of the black-footed ferret is the prairie dog. Prairie dogs, once again, they live in dens, so they dig holes, of course. And as we began to move westward and convert natural grasslands and prairie to rangeland for cattle and other livestock, cow sticks foot in prairie dog hole and breaks its leg, and therefore the rancher must shoot the cow. and that costs the ranchers money. And so, just like with the wolf, if you interfere with our livelihood, our history shows that we're going to do what to you? That's right, we're going to kill you. Okay, now this, I gave you a handout. I don't know how well you can read this on your handout, but you need to be very familiar with this, especially for your free response. And it's a great little box from the textbook that I think you need to be aware of. Characteristics of species that are prone to biological and ecological extinction, the characteristic of low reproductive rate, meaning a case strategist, specialized niche, narrow distribution, ones that reside at higher trophic levels, fixed migratory patterns, rare, commercially valuable, large territories. Look at the examples and make sure that you could tell me an example of an organism that has a specialized niche and one that has low reproductive rates. Those are very easy. But also, what about distribution? What about ones that have these fixed migratory patterns? Think about birds, think about turtles, think about whales. All of those things have fixed migratory patterns. Remember, sea turtles will come back and lay their eggs in the same exact place. What about ones that are rare? They're only are these endemic species that are found nowhere else. Look at the top right here. Low population density, specialized niche, low reproductive rate, fixed migratory patterns. Be very familiar with those, okay? I gave you this handout as well, and I believe you have to fill in either the percentages or the names to the left, so make sure you do that. Everything on this slide you need to be aware of. If you look at it, basically this is the percentage of various types of species threatened with premature extinction because of human activities. 34% of all fish species and 51% of all freshwater species are threatened with extinction. Why? Overharvesting, building of dams. Mammals, 24% of mammals are threatened with extinction. Remember, the ones that are most threatened are the apes and the monkeys. The highest number of mammals threatened with extinction are in Indonesia, and you need to know that. If you look at birds, 12% of all birds are threatened with extinction, 14% of plants. And here's something that we're going to get into in our next unit, which will be after the first semester. 90% of our food crops were domesticated from wild tropical plants. So if you want to know what's the importance of tropical diversity, there you go. Since 90% of our food crops were domesticated from wild tropical plants, that's a big deal. Okay, so we get back to the whole thing when we talked about before about instrumental value, economic versus ecological value. This is the importance of wild species. And so we need to remember both of those represent instrumental value or use value, okay? And when you talk about ecological value, we're talking about things like pollination, the ability to cycle matter and to move energy through and among different organisms. This is a big deal. Okay, so it says some economic and ecological benefits of present species have not been identified. We're destroying a chance for the future. We've already talked about this really in the fact that many species, we don't know how many species exist on Earth, and therefore we don't really know what impact we're having on diversity if we don't know all the species that are on Earth. What do species give us? We talked about the foxglove in an earlier chapter with digitalis. So we know that there are many medicinal properties found in plants. We know that all of our living organisms provide a source of genetic information that helps them adapt and produce new species as environmental changes occur. The problem is with human activities, the environmental changes are coming much faster. And of course, recreational value provided by plants and animals as well. Now, so what do we do? What do we do if we go to a developing country and say, well, you need to stop doing this, and we know you're starving and all that sort of thing. One thing that's been successful, especially in Costa Rica, I think we may have already talked about that, I'm not sure, is ecotourism. And so something I want you to be very aware of is, look what's in parentheses there, locally owned. It says ecotourism generates money to help poor countries as long as the company is locally owned. If you have some multinational company or an American company that is operating in a developing country with some ecotourism, where's most of the money going? Is it staying there? Is most of it coming back to the host country or the home country? And that's very important to distinguish there. Okay. As I said, your book says that a male lion skin is worth about $1,000. A male living for 7 years produces over $500,000 in tourist dollars with photo safaris and things like that. Bats, another example. We've already talked about the flying fox, and we talked about the durian fruit and the importance of the flying fox. We know that bats are often targeted for destruction because they damage crops. They're eating other, like the durian fruit, that are very desirable by humans. Bats are a keystone species. Why? Because they aid in pollination. They aid in distribution of seeds. And once again, one of the biggest problems with bats and why people don't value bats is they don't understand or appreciate their ecological role. Once again, other people, if you go to the other side of let the pendulum swing all the way the other way, many people believe that just because a species exists, it has the right to exist. It has intrinsic value, which is non-use value. And this is something we need to be aware of. And then we can't forget microorganisms. Remember, microorganisms, these are the main organisms that are helping to cycle and do the final decomposition of matter. And if we did not have them, the cycle would end and we would be in trouble. Okay, another thing, this is going to be a change in your notes. In your notes, you have this acronym called HIPPO. And this is something that I know that the College Board expects you to know. And so make sure you know this. It says there are several causes of depletion and premature extinction of wild plants and animals. And we use the acronym HIPPO. However, since your book was published in 2004, I believe, they now have changed this acronym to HIPCO. HIPPCO. And you need to know what this means. It means H stands for habitat destruction and fragmentation. It is the number one cause. Okay. So what is the number one cause of depletion and premature extinction of plants and animals? Habitat destruction or habitat fragmentation. The number two cause is invasive or alien species. The third cause is population growth, meaning us, too many people consuming too much stuff. The second P stands for pollution. And so that would include both water pollution and both air pollution. And then the new one, which is C, stands for climate change. So we are now seeing that climate change is actually ahead of over-harvesting of our biodiversity. And so we've added climate change in here as the next to the last cause for the depletion and premature extinction of plants and animals. And as I mentioned again, over-harvesting would be another one. So those are 6 reasons for depletion and premature extinction of plants and animals. Make sure you know that. Another term that I think we've already talked about is biophilia. Edward O. Wilson said that we have this inherent affinity for the natural world. We like to be in nature, and this makes us very unique from other organisms, and he termed this biophilia. And so you need to make sure you remember what that term is. You can take a look at this. It's really kind of what I just went over. Okay, look at the bottom. I basically summarized the whole slide, to be honest with you, at the bottom left here. And so if you look at the greatest species eliminators, you look at deforestation in the tropical rainforest. We're seeing the greatest number of species being lost. Number 2 would be loss of wetlands, and number 3 would be plowing of the grasslands. Now remember, we already learned that most of the grasslands have disappeared. What have we done to them? Right, we've turned them into either agricultural fields or range for livestock. It says emphasis is now shifting to the tropics, where the greatest species termination is occurring through habitat destruction. This is, once again, deforestation. We learned about this in chapter 11. So it says major habitat disturbance factors are, in order of importance, agriculture, commercial development, water development, outdoor recreation, livestock grazing, and pollution. Endemic species, we've already talked about this. Once again, these are species found nowhere else on Earth. Where do we find one of the highest percentages of endemic species? The island of Madagascar. And remember, I told you in Madagascar, we're also dealing with deforestation and high rates of erosion. And so we see a lot of habitat islands where we find, especially real islands, we see a lot of endemic species because, once again, they're geographically isolated. It says habitat fragmentation leads to species vulnerability to predator disease and so forth. So species are limited by their ability to colonize new areas and find mates and food when we see if they live in these habitat islands. Okay. Approximately 70% of the world's known species of birds are in decline. It says 1 in 6 species are threatened with extinction, mainly due to habitat loss. Non-native species are the second. We already talked about that with HIPCO. Birds, once again, environmental indicators. We know that they're easy to track and count. We know that they have important ecological roles. And once again, birds are a great indicator species because, once again, they're widespread and they're found all over the globe. This is a couple of pictures here I want to show you. It talks about the Indian tiger. It talks about the range today and the range 100 years ago. And so if you look at where I put the arrows, the range 100 years ago represents what? What type of extinction? Is it local, ecological, or biological? And the answer is they are locally extinct. Okay. Now, if you look in the red areas, that's where they're found today, so they're not locally extinct there. Now, could they also be ecologically extinct in those areas where they ranged 100 years ago? Sure, they could be. You would have to know a little bit more about it to know if the ecosystem is intact or not. Here is the black rhino. Very few pockets. The African elephant. And, of course, the Asian or Indian elephant. Here are U.S. songbirds that are threatened with extinction. As you can see, you may know some of those between the different types of warblers and sparrows and Kirkland warblers. Sometimes they're not nice to each other, as you see there. Okay, non-native species. Once again, the second biggest threat to premature extinction is, of course, non-native species. It says many non-native species provide us with food, medicine, and other benefits, but some replace native species and disrupt ecosystems, causing large economic losses. Here's something I'm going to ask you for sure. The largest economic losses are caused by crop weeds and crop diseases. And to understand that, all you have to think about is how much money does a farmer have to pay to protect himself or herself against weeds, against crop diseases, and how much money do they lose because of this? And because if you think about drought and things like that too. But this is an important point. It says invasion of alien species can lead to extinction. Non-native species introduction into an ecosystem can destroy it. Almost half of the endangered and threatened species are now on the list of threatened and endangered species because of non-native species. And we need to be aware of that. Here's a little, I found this online, so I'm going to show this to you. It's kind of, I don't know who did it, but it was on YouTube. So there you go. Okay, so let's go back here. All right, so I think we already talked about feral pigs in the previous chapter. It says some of these species threaten and endanger native species because they have no natural predators, no competitors or pathogens in their new habitat. And so when they come into the new habitat, their natural predators not there, and therefore their populations can explode. We can have an eruptive population growth. It says that can trigger ecological disruptions such as the wild African honeybee and the Formosan termite. Here are two invasive species we should be aware of. The Africanized honeybee, once again, was caused because of the in South America, a researcher was trying to breed a wild African honeybee with a domestic honeybee. The wild African honeybees are very aggressive, and so they were trying to breed in the increased honey production while making the bee more docile. And what happened was they got loose, and now they're spread across the Southern California, Texas, and we don't know if they're going to stop before they reach where we live or not. And this is a big problem. Feral pigs, once again, deliberately introduced, cause all sorts of damage. Feral cats and domestic cats kill many birds each year. Kudzu, if anybody had to name one invasive species, most people could list kudzu. Well, why is kudzu here? Kudzu was introduced to the South in the 1930s because it grew very rapid. It had a tremendous root structure that would hold the soil structure together and to prevent erosion. There are indications that it may be a good source of tree-free paper, and a Japanese company in Alabama is processing kudzu for starch that they ship to Japan. Some say it's also used in herbal remedies. Okay, the next is, once again, the Argentina fire ant. You saw this in a video I showed you with E.O. Wilson. Remember, he was the first at the age of 13 to identify this as a non-native species in Alabama. Most likely the Argentina fire ant was a stowaway in shipping crates that were brought back after World War II was over. And same thing with the, not Argentina fire ant, the Formosan termite probably came from Asia in shipping crates. The Argentine fire ant, very aggressive and has a great ability to persist. Generally, many of them are resistant to pesticides, and that's a big problem too. It says the best control is to prevent non-native species from being introduced. It says identify the types of ecosystems that are vulnerable to invaders. So we need to look at what makes a species vulnerable to an invasive species and what makes an ecosystem vulnerable to invasion by a non-native species. And this is what we need to do. That's why we have inspections. That's why when you ship something from overseas to the United States, it has to go through an inspection. When you go on vacation, if you go to another country, they're always going to ask you, do you have anything to declare? Did you have any food products or plants or any kind of animals with you? So let's take another look at deer. We've talked about deer several times. I've told you my thoughts on this. But deer are edge species. They live in the woods. They feed in open areas. Deer actually kill more people in the U.S. than any other wild species due to collisions between deer and vehicles. And I know we've talked in class before about whoever has hit a deer. And I told you I've hit two. And it is a scary thing, especially if you hit one at night. And they can damage your car, total your car, and you can be killed if they come through the windshield. There's no easy answer for the overpopulation of deer. Do we increase deer season? Do we create some type of deer birth control? This is very expensive and time consuming. Anyway, we're back. So what do? What is the solution to deer? I've told you that if we had more predators that would prey on deer, your deer population wouldn't be as bad, or would it? Habitat loss due to human encroachment is what's the biggest problem, and so having mountain lions roaming the neighborhoods may or may not be a good idea. Or do we actually start hunting more? So there's another solution, if you will. Okay, so what about invasive species that were deliberately introduced? I want you to be aware of several of these. First off, Africanized honeybee. Remember, it wasn't deliberately introduced in the United States, but because it was introduced into the Americas, this is one that was brought in to try to increase honey production. The purple loosestrife. We don't see a lot of this here, but this is an invasive species, and I'll show you a video clip about the purple loosestrife here in a minute. The water hyacinth, I hope I have time to show you a video about this. This is a big problem in many freshwater lakes, and in Lake Victoria and Africa, it's a big, big problem. Living where we live, we see Japanese beetles all the time, and if your folks have any rose bushes and things like that, you'll have trouble with Japanese beetle. Another is the nutria, and if you're in class and you've ever looked up on the shelf, you'll see a stuffed nutria that we have that was actually an albino nutria. These are invasive in the United States. We have them in North Carolina. We have them. They're bad in Alabama. There are actually you can actually get paid for killing some of these animals. We talked about the European wild boar. So let's go on. Oh, the European starling. I'm glad I said that. Well, like I said, we don't see the passenger pigeon in the United States, but we do see a lot of European starlings. And this is this is the most common bird in the United States, and it was brought here, believed to be brought here by a group that would like to introduce all of the types of birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare works. And so I find that quite interesting. Argentine fire ant, we talked about that. Zebra mussel, we mentioned that. The Formosan termite, this is a big, big problem in the South, especially in New Orleans. The brown tree snake in Guam. We consider this a United States, it's one of our territories. So the brown tree snake is a big, big problem in Guam. Here's a picture from the textbook of kudzu that just covers everything. Here is the fire ant in 1918. You see the range. And then, of course, you see the range once again in the year 2000. So you see the spread of the fire ant is pretty extensive. I gave you a copy of this on the handout. You make sure you study this. Characteristics of successful invader species and characteristics of ecosystems vulnerable to invader species. So most of this you probably already know, but you do need to know this. Here's another video clip that I think you'll find pretty interesting.
You may not know it, but we're under attack. Everywhere you look and in every habitat you'll find something that doesn't belong here. Invasive species have found their way into the United States, and they're not good house guests. It is estimated that invasive species cost the United States up to $120 billion per year in damages and control costs. Many people are aware of the thousands of invasive plants and insect pests in the United States, but few may be mindful of the more than 1,000 invasive wildlife species who also call the U.S. home. Wildlife Services, a program in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, is one group working to prevent, control, and eradicate these unwanted animal invaders. The National Wildlife Research Center, or NWRC, is the research arm of the Wildlife Services program. Together with Wildlife Services field specialists, NWRC researchers are protecting America's agriculture and native ecosystems from invasive species. Let's take a closer look at 5 of the worst animal invaders in the United States, what's being done to curb their impacts, and the research behind new invasive species management tools and techniques. The first animal in our top 5 countdown probably won't surprise you. Many of the rats you see are invasive species. The roof rat and others such as the Polynesian rat and Norway rat can have a big impact when they invade ecosystems. This is especially true for island ecosystems, where native plants and animals have evolved in relative isolation from competitors and predators. In addition to ecological damage, invasive rats can also damage agricultural crops, contaminate stored foods, damage structures and property, and transmit disease. Wildlife Services experts in Hawaii and other locations help reduce problems caused by invasive rats through the development and use of repellents, rodenticides, barriers, and detection and monitoring devices. They also assist state and non-governmental organizations with rodent eradication efforts on the Aleutian, Hawaiian, Caribbean, and other islands. These efforts have greatly improved the abundance and diversity of native plants and animals on the treated islands. A recent study conducted by Wildlife Services scientists at the National Wildlife Research Center's Hawaii Field Station led to the development of a new rodent-proof nest box. Researchers are hopeful the new nest box will help in the recovery of some of Hawaii's endangered birds, including the Kauai thrush. Number 4 on our top 5 animal invaders countdown is another rodent, but this one is much larger than your average rat. The nutria is a semi-aquatic rodent native to South America. It can grow up to 2 feet in length and weigh close to 30 pounds. The nutria was originally brought to the United States in 1889 for the fur industry. When consumer demands for fur dropped in the 1940s, many of the animals were released either intentionally or accidentally into wetlands across the southern United States. Today, this invasive species is found in approximately 30 states. Their burrowing damages wetlands, levees, and other structures, and they can overgraze native wetland plants, eat agricultural crops, and girdle trees. Wildlife Services experts are actively involved in nutria management and removal. Field specialists work with local, state, and federal partners to conduct assessments and develop management plans that include protecting native vegetation, soil, and other natural resources from nutria damage. For example, Wildlife Services is leading the first large-scale North American effort to eradicate nutria in Maryland, where the rodents have devastated coastal Chesapeake Bay marshes. To aid in removal efforts, NWRC researchers have designed and tested new nutria lures and traps, including a new multiple capture trap. Compared to traditional traps, this live trap reduces the amount of effort required to capture multiple animals and prevents the accidental loss of non-target animals. We can blame the presence of our next invader in our top 5 countdown on poet and playwright William Shakespeare. The European starling was brought and released into the United States in 1890 by Shakespeare aficionados. They wanted to establish populations of all the different bird species ever mentioned in Shakespeare's works. It turns out starlings were noted for their mimicking abilities in Shakespeare's Henry IV. Starlings easily adapted to a variety of habitats, nest sites, and food sources, and thus spread quickly across the country. Today there are more than 200 million starlings in North America. The birds often gather in large flocks and roosts. They can damage agricultural crops, cause sanitation and disease problems, compete with native birds, and consume and contaminate livestock feed. Techniques for dispersing and removing starlings vary from hazing devices such as propane cannons and other noisemakers to repellents and toxicants. At the NWRC, researchers are not only developing and registering new management tools, but are also investigating the role starlings play in disease transmission, particularly at feedlots and dairies. Studies have shown that salmonella contamination of feed and water at feedlots is strongly related to the number of starlings present at the facilities. Researchers believe that starlings may be moving contaminated cattle feces on their feet, legs, and feathers from one location to another. Slithering into number 2 on our countdown is one of the most notable invasive species ever to find its way onto American soil, the brown tree snake. The snake is native to Australia, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and Indonesia, and was accidentally introduced to the island of Guam soon after World War II, probably as a stowaway in ship cargo. With the absence of natural predators and other population controls, the brown tree snake population on Guam quickly reached unprecedented numbers, with approximately 13,000 snakes per square mile. The snakes have caused the extinction of many of the island's native birds and bat species. It's also caused thousands of power outages, widespread loss of domestic birds and pets, and considerable emotional trauma to residents and visitors. Since 1995, Wildlife Services has worked with numerous groups, including the U.S. Department of Defense, to research methods to manage brown tree snakes and prevent their spread to other areas, such as the Hawaiian Islands. A recent assessment by NWRC economists showed that if the brown tree snake were to become established on Hawaii, at similar levels to those on Guam, the total estimated damage from medical incidents, power outages, and decreases in tourism would range from $590 million to $2 billion annually. To prevent this from happening and reduce damages on Guam, Wildlife Services field specialists trap snakes, use trained snake detector dogs to find snakes in cargo, conduct nighttime spotlight searches, and promote public education. To date, Wildlife Services has removed more than 150,000 snakes from Guam's ports and airports. This is in addition to the thousands of snakes removed every year through Wildlife Services baiting efforts across the island. NWRC researchers have aided in these efforts through the development and registration of the first snake toxicant and fumigants, as well as snake traps, lures, attractants, and reproductive inhibitors. Number 1 on our countdown of the 5 worst animal invaders in the United States is ripping and rooting its way across America. Found in at least 35 states with a population of more than 5 million, feral swine cause approximately $1 billion in damages and control costs each year. The damage caused by feral swine seems endless and ranges from destroying native habitats, agricultural crops and property, to spreading disease. Wildlife Services provides technical advice and recommendations to landowners, state agencies, and others, as well as direct management assistance for feral swine problems in more than 30 states. Experts provide a 3-prong approach that involves operational activities, disease surveillance, and research. Operational activities include trapping, shooting, fencing, and habitat modification. Wildlife Services wildlife disease biologists monitor feral swine for diseases that can affect livestock, people, and pets. If a foreign animal disease such as foot and mouth disease were to enter the United States, feral swine could potentially spread the disease to domestic swine or other susceptible animals. Thus, one area of NWRC research focuses on methods to curb an emergency disease epidemic in feral swine. Other research includes the development of oral toxicants and vaccines. However, before any of these new technologies can be used, a swine-specific delivery system must be developed that prevents native species from accessing baits. Results from field tests of new delivery systems are promising, and researchers are hopeful they'll soon have new options for controlling feral swine. As worldwide trade and travel continues to grow, so too will the challenges for land managers, ecologists, and biologists dealing with invasive species. Public involvement and commitment to preventing the spread of unwanted animal invaders is key to the future health and sustainability of our native wildlife and ecosystems. To learn more, please visit our website at www.aphis.usda.gov/wildlife_damage/NWRC.
Meet the king of the Illinois River.
Wow.
And a big show-off.
Muscular. Very muscular. I mean, this thing will hurt you. Yes, yes. They can jump out of the water at high speeds. They can jump a great distance out of the water, up to 8 feet out of the water.
Fast, easy to startle, and voracious eaters, Asian silver carp are a jarring sight here, and a hit on YouTube. But Greg Sass, until recently with the Illinois Natural History Survey, says that in the long history of this waterway, what's also remarkable is when this fish got here, just 20 years ago.
By the mid-2000s, it was becoming a crisis, not only with fish jumping everywhere, but just what was showing up in our catches, the amount of Asian carp versus the native fishes.
Just amazing how wide it is.
With no natural predators in this stretch of the river in central Illinois, up to 9 out of 10 fish here are now Asian carp.
We've seen explosive population growth. We've seen a population that has doubled almost every year since 2000 here. We're fairly confident we have the highest wild densities of Asian carp anywhere in the world.
Which is quite a feat, considering this fish is from China. The Illinois River has been invaded.
fish are behaving in a way that we're not used to. They're doing things to the ecosystem that we're not completely sure what kind of effect there's going to be yet. And there's just an incredible abundance of them.
It's an invasion from coast to coast, from Africanized killer honeybees in the Southwest to South American nutria in Louisiana, to the spread of the Burmese python in the Florida Everglades, all part of a scary trend.
Everywhere we look, we see species that are spreading and damaging our natural ecosystems now, and when scientists look into the future, they see the potential for many more damaging species.
You make it sound like we're under attack everywhere.
We are under attack everywhere.
David Lodge is a biologist at the University of Notre Dame. He says our agricultural system depends on plant and animal species imported to America, like wheat and cows and pigs. But that doesn't make them invaders.
An invasive species is a species that's been transported from one part of the planet to the other by people, and a species that has a harmful impact.
And typically transported by design, by accident, a little bit of both.
Both. Lots of invasive species have been transported by accident in the ballast water of ships, or as a hidden pest on plants that have been imported. But many have also been imported intentionally.
Like the Shakespeare fan who, back in the 1890s, set out to bring to America every bird mentioned in the Bard's plays.
I think we can be grateful that he was unsuccessful for a great many of those birds, but he was amazingly successful with starlings. Starlings are now one of the most common birds in North America, and a nuisance.
Today, they number more than 200 million. Most species were introduced for practical reasons, like the Asian carp, which was imported to clean catfish ponds in Arkansas.
But, as is almost always the case, they escaped. And it wasn't really until perhaps the 1980s that biologists in the Mississippi Basin realized this was a growing problem that was likely to get very severe.
Asian carp migrated up the Mississippi River to its tributaries, the Missouri and Illinois. Today, only a series of electric barriers in Chicago's shipping channels separate the fish from the Great Lakes and its $7 billion commercial and recreational fishing industry. Now consider kudzu, nicknamed the vine that ate the South.
As you can see, it's taken over the vegetation that was here. It's overtopping the small trees. It's overtopping the taller trees, and it will eventually shade them out. The trees will die, and it'll all come down to the ground, and everything that's here will be kudzu. There won't be anything living in here except for kudzu.
Back in the 30s, the U.S. government paid farmers to plant this Japanese vine to control erosion.
And the kudzu began to exemplify the theory of unintended consequences very well. It got everywhere that it wasn't supposed to get.
John Taylor of the U.S. Forest Service says kudzu, which can grow as fast as a foot a day, now covers up to 8 million acres of the South, snapping power lines and blanketing trees and even structures like this barn in rural Georgia.
And it will eventually cover the whole building. Look at this. And pull it down. And you're getting kudzu bugs all over everybody.
Itself an invasive species, popularly known in this region as the stink bug.
These little fellows like to overwinter in dwellings, and they create quite a furor when people are not used to having hundreds of thousands of these little critters invade their house. And when they're disturbed, their defensive response is a very offensive odor. So you might go sweep them out, but you'll get a surprise in the process.
Taylor says scientists do know how to eradicate kudzu.
The problem is spending the money that it would take to control large areas and the time that it would take over multiple years to control kudzu. It's not a feasible activity.
The bill would run into the billions, which brings us to the national tab for invasive species. Notre Dame's David Lodge.
The costs to the U.S. economy from invasive species generally are on the order of at least $120 billion annually.
Costs like the $10 billion that cities will spend over the next 10 years to treat or replace the millions of ash trees caught in the path of the emerald ash borer, a bug that likely found its way from China on wooden shipping pallets. Or the tens of millions of dollars spent clearing pipes and harbors covered in trillions of zebra and quagga mussels, brought to the Great Lakes on ships from Europe. As the world grows more interconnected, Lodge says the problem will only grow worse.
There's just more opportunity now to move species intentionally and unintentionally around the globe.
Few parts of the country have more experience with that than South Florida.
You got a lot of trade, a lot of international tourism, a lot of international cargo, and you have a climate where whatever gets here lives forever.
Adam Putnam is Florida's agriculture commissioner. He says that in recent years his state has endured infestations that range from the exotic, like Burmese pythons and Gambian pouched rats, to vital threats to agriculture, like the Mediterranean fruit fly. On his radar now, the giant African land snail, which can lay 1,200 eggs a year.
It was like a dream or something. It was like a mythic creature that walked across. It was about that big.
And they're really slithery and juicy, and they have all kinds of fluids coming out.
I don't like it. For me, it's disgusting.
With something like snails, we've got the trifecta. It carries human meningitis, so people are concerned. It eats 500 different plants, so agriculture is concerned. And it eats houses, so homeowners are very concerned.
This stucco-eating pest that can grow up to 8 inches long has brought together a team of 70 people, including representatives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Nationally, 30 federal agencies are involved in the fight against invasive species, with about $1.5 billion spent annually. Federal or state, funding is a struggle.
It's difficult. Screenings at the airport and seaport face other pressures to look for drugs, to look for bombs, to look for other weapons of mass destruction. So post 9/11, you see less of a focus on snails and citrus canker and laurel wilt disease and things like that.
Unsuspecting travelers bringing pests and diseases daily.
One solution for Florida, educating the public.
Wherever you're coming from, leave all that stuff behind, because any one of those things can carry the larva that's going to become the fly that's going to wipe out a $100 billion industry in our state.
Prevention is key, David Lodge argues, but also our biggest challenge.
For the most part, in the United States, we continue to operate under what I would describe as an open door policy. With very few exceptions, it is legal to import alive into the United States almost any plant or animal that exists on the planet. And there are at least 1.7 million species on the planet.
So when it comes to invasive species, as we say in the reporting business, this is a story with legs.
All right, so that was a great segment from CBS this Sunday morning, I guess it was. I've got another one to show you about hunting exotic species in a little bit. Smuggling wildlife. So as you heard on there from the professor from Notre Dame, that it's almost legal to import any animal that exists on Earth if you know the right kind of paperwork to fill out and so forth. But the smuggling of wildlife is the third most profitable illegal border crossing activity after arms and drugs. And so if there's money to be made in it, somebody's going to pay somebody to try to move something from here to there. And so that's just the fact. So it's the third most profitable illegal border crossing smuggling activity after arms and drugs. Once again, when you look at transporting these exotic wildlife and smuggling them, about 2/3 of them die in transit. I want you to remember that. So that's another problem with the capture and smuggling of these wildlife or these types of organisms, because 2/3 of them are going to actually die in transit. It says animals are worth a great deal. They die to the use of animal parts in the Middle East and China. It says tiger populations have declined dramatically since the 50s because of habitat loss, poaching for fur and bones. Elephant declines in addition to habitat loss and poaching or the ivory trade, and once again, low reproductive rates. Don't forget about that slide I showed you that showed the characteristics that make species prone to extinction. Okay, bushmeat. Here's another subject that is, You may not have even heard of this. This is basically the consumption of wild meat. And we're not talking about deer. It says bushmeat has supplied indigenous people with food for many, many centuries, really. And because the population numbers traditionally were very low, the environmental impact was very low, it was a sustainable process. Demand has now gone up. Resources have dwindled. The amount of people that hunt and the bushmeat trade is skyrocketing. It says there's been an 8-fold increase in Africa's population. Logging roads, remember we talked about this in the last chapter. Logging roads that's the way we get entry into these areas. That allows ranchers and miners and settlers into these areas that were once inaccessible. There are restaurants around the world that serve bushmeat dishes, many of them in Europe. It says people living in poverty use the selling of bushmeat to collectors, meat suppliers, and poachers as a means of survival. And so once again, population comes into play here, and of course, poverty comes into play here. Here's a picture from the textbook of a gorilla head in a dish. There you see it can be quite disturbing.
Though recognized as an endangered species since 1975, chimpanzee numbers are still in critical decline.
When I began in 1960, there were at least 1 million chimpanzees right across to West Africa. And today, no more than 150,000 at most.
At the heart of their declining population is an alarming practice.
It's not just that their habitat's disappearing, which it is, just as it has here, but it's also that they're hunted. They're hunted to some extent for the live animal trade, but they're also hunted for meat, along with gorillas and bonobos and elephants and everything that walks or flies in the forests of Congo and West Africa. It's called the bushmeat trade. And this has grown because the old kind of subsistence hunting that has been a way of life for the people in the forest for hundreds of years has changed because logging companies and to some extent mining companies have made roads deep into the heart of the last remaining forests. And this provides access for the hunters from the towns who go to the end of the logging road and shoot everything for food. Chimpanzees, gorillas, elephants, antelopes, monkeys, birds, bats. They dry it in the sun or they smoke it and they ship it into the towns.
As commercial logging has expanded, the practice has only become more widespread.
And when it's done on a commercial scale, it can wipe out the wildlife in a forest, even when the forest is left standing.
Well, I'm not sure anyone knows how big the bushmeat trade is, but it's estimated to be $1 billion industry. And it has its tentacles into every continent on Earth in terms of the flow out of Africa.
And when you have snares that have been kept there to catch, even if it's not chimpanzees that are being caught, they always end up being caught in some of these snares.
But the cruelest fate of all is reserved for the youngest chimps.
In the old days, no respectable hunter would shoot a mother with a baby because that's like laying the goose that lays the golden egg. But now mothers are shot. So, as a result of this, the babies are being sold beside the cut-up bodies of the mothers in the market.
So what we're doing is working to try to change attitudes and practices. We're trying to get enforcement so that this illegal practice is not allowed by governments. But we're also trying to change the attitudes of people, what they eat, what they understand about the forest, what their children in particular care about.
And for many orphan chimps, the Jane Goodall Institute is the only hope for survival.
When we can persuade governments to cooperate, these babies are confiscated because it is illegal in most of these site-range countries. And then the baby chimps are brought to the Jane Goodall Institute representatives, and we have to care for them in sanctuaries. We can't put them back in the wild, they have to learn how to live. There isn't really enough habitat for the wild chimps, and in addition they trust people and they wander into a village and get hurt or hurt someone. It's been estimated that chimpanzees cannot survive more than 15 to 20 years unless we do something right now to halt the bushmeat trade, or at least to reduce the bushmeat trade and to prevent it entirely for the great apes.
By donating to the Jane Goodall Institute or adopting a chimpanzee, you can help eliminate bushmeat trade. The continued survival of chimpanzees and other great apes depends upon it.
Please join us and help us save the chimpanzees today.
Okay, so that was pretty good. And so one thing that the book mentions here is that how hunting practices have impacted species. The red colobus monkey is a species of monkey that has been have been driven to extinction because of hunting, and so that is an extinct monkey that has been driven to extinction, like I said, because of hunting practices. It says it also negatively impacts forest carnivores by depleting their main prey, and the forest itself is damaged by a decrease in seed dispersing animals. So this all goes along with the bushmeat. It says other extinction threats. Once again, people try to exterminate species that compete with them. We've talked about this over and over again. Coyotes, prairie dogs, wolves, bobcats. Once again, they prey on livestock, or they interrupt our aquaculture, and we're going to try to get rid of them. And so oftentimes by getting rid of one of those pest species, for instance, we affect the ecological, the functioning of the ecosystem. And we'll talk about that here. So this is another story of unintended consequences that I want you to be very aware of. And so if you look at it, 99% of the prairie dogs in the United States have been eradicated. And the main reason they were eradicated, or the main way that they were eradicated, is through poisoning. And this was all sponsored by our own government. And because, like I said, they build dens, cow steps in a prairie dog hole, breaks its leg, farmer's out of money. So this was a poisoning that was directed at the pest species, the prairie dog, and without an understanding of its ecological role. And because of the poisoning of the prairie dogs, it nearly drove the black-footed ferret to extinction, because the main prey of the black-footed ferret is the prairie dog. And so this is, once again, here's a great story of unintended consequences, just as the elimination of the gray wolf in Yellowstone was an example of unintended consequences there. And so these are two good stories for us to remember and take with us with this course. Here's a great video from the black-footed ferret breeding center.
Because of the way things evolved at Meeteetse, I think the story kind of unfolded in a way probably that none of us expected it would. Canine distemper was discovered and plague was discovered, and everything changed quickly.
The early detection of the disease provides us with an opportunity, however slim, to try and save some individual animals from the infected area that will be added to the captive propagation effort. Hopefully this effort will allow perpetuation of the species.
Since they were going to go extinct in the wild, they were rescued, brought into captivity by Wyoming Game and Fish Department.
1986 was really a terrible year for us. In the winter of '85, just preceding that, we'd gotten down to 10 animals in total, 4 in the wild, 6 that we had brought into captivity, but in 1986, those 6 did not breed, so we were thinking, some of us, that we were repeating the Patuxent experience and would end up with nothing, and instead of enhancing the conservation, we'd be enhancing the extinction of these animals.
Scarface was rather large. He was a big ferret, probably one of the largest ones that came out, and he had a scar down his face, so that's how he got his name.
Our association with Scarface actually began when he was in the wild. This was in the winter of 1986 and into the spring of 1987, where we spent a lot of time trying to catch him. We knew he was out there, but he was very difficult to find and even more difficult to catch. By spring of '87, we finally waited for a big snowstorm, tracked him to a burrow, and set a trap on that burrow, and said, we'll sit here for as long as it takes. And it took about a week. He finally did come out and get caught. In fact, he was the last animal we found at Batitsi that we wanted to bring into captivity.
18 ferrets rescued from the wild.
When we first brought him in, I'll never forget, because it was super exciting. You know, the electricity in the area was like, wow, this has never been done before. This is something exciting, and you know, if anybody was going to make it work, it was going to be Tom and Beth.
If we're successful in maintaining a founder group of animals for our captive breeding effort, and if they reproduce as we hope and predict they will, then we should, within a couple of years, and I don't want to be pinned down to the number of years because we don't know how quick this will develop, we should have animals for reintroduction.
A lot of the credit needs to go to the folks with Wyoming Game and Fish that took the lead with captive breeding, notably the late Tom Thorne and Beth Williams, as well as Don Kwiatkowski, who managed the Sebille captive breeding facility. They're the ones who actually, you know, trial and error, they had to produce kits to grow that captive population.
Several other partners came in, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Captive Breeding Specialist Group of the International Conservation of Nature Union, and AZA, the American Zoological Association. All these people came together, experts in captive breeding, to try and save this species.
And everything that we did, of course, was slow, quiet, methodical. There was just a lot of watching them. You know, just making sure that they would make the noise, that they would come out, they would be alert, they would eat. But yet there was a lot of unknowns. Everybody was kind of on pins and needles. You know, we knew the females were pregnant, but were they going to have the litter successfully? Were they going to take care of the litter?
So we were elated when we got Scarface in, and he immediately bred a couple females, and they produced kits in '87.
Once he had babies, it was like, let's raise them, let's breed them, and let them have babies. So I think once we were over that hump and knew that it could be done.
They figured out how to do it here in Wyoming, and then we spread ferrets around to other zoos.
The Sebille facility, we produced tons of ferrets up there from the late 80s to 2005, when we moved all the ferrets down to this facility, the new National Black-Footed Ferret Conservation Center in northern Colorado, where we house about 70% of the world's captive stock. We have 5 partner zoos across North America that are breeding black-footed ferrets.
Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, our first breeding season was in the spring of 1991. We have adopted what's called as adaptive management with black-footed ferrets, because nobody knows everything. So we see what works, we do some research, we have one facility try something with diet or with how to monitor their breeding readiness, and then we can learn from that and go forward.
We have a stud book. It's kind of the electronic family tree of the black-footed ferret line, and we use that and a lot of very fancy schmancy computer programs to determine what males and females get paired with each other.
It's a giant computer dating service. It's such a small genetic pool from those 18 that were brought in that we try and maximize every animal so we don't lose any more genetics than we know we're going to lose with every generation.
It's a big challenge every year, just making sure that they're healthy enough to reproduce, and then just tracking their progress while they're getting into breeding season.
Our typical year, we start doing our male and female reproductive readiness checks in January. Black-footed ferrets are seasonal breeders, so we have to get them when they're ready to go.
Ferrets are unusual, not that they are seasonal, but that they are called induced ovulators, so they will only ovulate if they are bred. So we want to make sure that it's a good match. They only really have one chance once a year, and they may only breed for 4 years.
Once the females are biologically ready to go, and the males are too, we put that male with the female, leave them together for a couple days.
Because some aren't good breeders, Dr. Jo Gail Howard from the National Zoo, she pioneered the artificial insemination of black-footed ferrets. So she worked out all the challenges there, and you can't just breed them like you do other domestic animals. You have to actually do a surgical procedure. So she takes the semen, can freeze it down, genome bank it, and she's actually been able to bring that animal back. The animal that died 20 years ago. Amazing work. Really hasn't been done in other species to the degree that we do it in black-footed ferrets.
The gestation period is 42 days.
We don't disturb her at all. We just turn on the closed circuit camera and we can watch to see if she'll whelp. And we watch and we watch and we watch.
The average litter size is 3 kits. We've had here in captivity litters range from 1 to 10.
We really want mom to raise them, and generally they're a great mom. Every kit is treated as if it would be released to the wild.
It's definitely hands up, especially the first 21 days. We usually just check on them occasionally. We will introduce meat to them at about 26 days of age. 37 days, the eyes will start opening, and then at 40 days, that's when we start introducing rodent into their diet so that they can actually get a taste of that.
They have to be pretty tough, so we start them off with hamsters, and if they aren't able to do it themselves, then mom will show them how, because that is their job, to be efficient predators, or else they won't make it in the wild.
Usually around 64 days, we'll give them their first canine distemper vaccination. And then at 90 days of age, they can actually be separated from their mother, and then they go to preconditioning if they're being released for the wild.
The overrepresented genes, those animals can go for release to the wild because it's so iffy if they'll make it in the wild. Whereas the really valuable, underrepresented, rare genes will stay in the breeding program. We've got the captive breeding part down. We know how to make ferrets. We're always kind of tweaking it to make more, better, but we can certainly provide the ferrets.
We can produce animals in captivity. About 175 to 200 annually can go out to reintroduction sites.
Several reintroduction sites have been started, and so what we're trying to do is eventually downlist and ultimately remove the black-footed ferret from the Endangered Species Act.
So you saw a couple good things there. Adaptive ecosystem management, adaptive management. They try to do things and they change their protocol as needed. That's a term that we need to be aware of, adaptive management. Another term that came up in there was induced ovulators, where they do breed seasonally, but they have to be bred in order to ovulate. And there are other animals that way as well. So it says here the legal and illegal trade in species is very profitable. We talked about that. Remember, we said that 2/3 die in transit. It's the third most illegal border crossing smuggling activity behind weapons and drugs. Amphibians, reptiles, mammals, tropical fish. Pet trade has impacted all of that as well. Tropical fish, not as much as in the past. We talked about this in class. Many of these are being bred in captivity, whereas 20 years ago, 25 years ago, a lot of them were being caught and shipped to the United States. Once again, what's the solution to all of this? You take people that were poaching animals and you show them another way that they can make a living through ecotourism. And once again, that is a solution. But what did we say about that as well? We said that as long as the money stays within the country, so if it's locally owned tourism business, that's how you're going to make that work. Exotic plants, cacti, orchids, once again, worth thousands of dollars in the illegal trade. Says wildlife reserves may be depleted within a few decades. Climate change, we talked about that, adding to the acronym HIPCO. Says pollution undermines all living species. Chemicals degrade the environment and kill species. Pesticides are especially deadly to honeybees, birds, and fish. We also need to remember about biological magnification. We've mentioned this a little bit so far. We'll go into more depth with this later, but as pesticides are accumulated within the tissues of living organisms, it magnifies as it gets higher and higher. We talked about the bald eagles and the birds of prey and how DDT affected them in an earlier chapter. It says protecting wild species, research and legal approach. It says treaties help protect endangered and threatened species, but enforcement is difficult and punishment is inadequate. I don't know why I put this right here, but here it is. We need to remember from Chapter 11, Bioinformatics, the applied science of managing, analyzing, communicating information. You had this in Chapter 11, so we'll move forward. Now we need to know some laws and treaties. This is something, once again, we don't just sit down and learn a list of laws or treaties or agreements between countries. We learn it as we go. So here's one you need to know. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. Okay, this is a international agreement, an international agreement to protect and restrict the commercial trade and transportation of endangered or threatened species. It says here the traded and restricts international trade for 29,000 species that may become threatened. This is a good thing. Once again, and this is something that you could say. If on the AP exam they ask you to list an international agreement that protects species, there's your best one because it's easy to remember. CITES, Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. Enforcement is difficult in a lot of these international agreements because many people either don't sign the agreement. For instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1995 was an agreement to reverse the decline of biodiversity. We as a country did not ratify this treaty, and one of the reasons was because there were no severe penalties or enforcement in place. Okay. Another law that we need to be aware of, two of the big laws in this country, or the biggest one is the Endangered Species Act. It's probably one of the one that has the most teeth. But go all the way back to 1900 to the Lacey Act. This is one I want you to know as well. The Lacey Act of 1900 prohibits the transportation of live or dead animals or their parts across state borders without a federal permit. If any of you have any kind of horses or cows and you've ever had to transport them across state line, by law, you have to have them inspected by a veterinarian. They have to have blood work drawn for certain diseases, and that blood work must come back, of course, negative. And you have to travel when you go across state lines. You're supposed to travel with that information. And if you're out in states like Colorado, California, Nevada, and even Arizona and Texas, you will see almost like truck stops, like you see where they weigh trucks. You'll see areas where they inspect your wildlife. If you're carrying, I'm sorry, not wildlife, but if you're carrying livestock, they will check to make sure that happens. I witnessed that myself in Nevada. But that's the Lacey Act. It was originally to prevent the transportation of animals across state borders, but also it was also used to restore bird populations in parts where they become scarce. Another law that you could put in there, besides the Lacey Act and the Endangered Species Act, is the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This was in 1972, and it was established federal responsibility to conserve marine mammals. So there's another piece of legislation. This would be a domestic legislation, just like the Lacey Act, to protect marine mammals. So now we have the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. We had the Convention on Biodiversity, the Lacey Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and now we have the Endangered Species Act of 1973, abbreviated ESA. And this is, once again, one of the most strict laws to protect species in the world, actually. The identification of endangered and threatened species is made by the National Marine Fisheries Service and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The National Marine Fisheries Service is responsible for identifying oceanic species that are threatened or endangered. All other species are listed and are under the control of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's a little bit of a distinction that we need to be aware of. And how do we do this? Look at what's in parentheses right here. All commercial shipments of wildlife must enter and exit the United States through one of 9 designated ports. So if you're going to go to South America and you're going to buy 100 llamas that you want to import in the United States, you better make sure you get your permits, because you're going to have to bring them through Miami's, most likely Miami's importation center, where they'll be quarantined for a certain amount of time until they're deemed safe to be released back to you to do with what you wish. The reason I know about this is because in I think it was 1990, a group of individuals went to, I guess it was Chile, and they bought a couple hundred llamas. They didn't have the right paperwork to bring them into the country. When they reached the port in Miami, the shipment was turned away, and these 200 some animals, these llamas, ended up on the island of Antigua in the Caribbean. Now let's remember, these are animals that have wool that can be about a foot long, and they're basically stuck on a tropical island. Eventually all of them died. There were efforts to send hay and things like that to them. But once again, they were in an area that they were not accustomed, very little fresh water, and they basically all died. And the reason they died was because somebody was trying to make money, and they didn't go through the proper channels to import these animals. And this was a sad situation that occurred in the 1990s. Biological facts form the basis of inclusion in the Endangered Species Act. It is not supposed to be based on economic or political factors. It's scientific research on the species if it enhances the survival of the species. So it says habitats of endangered species must be protected. This is where a lot of people say that it goes too far. If I have an endangered species on my property, then I may be limited as to what I can do on my property. Now, the one organization that's exempt from the Endangered Species Act is the Department of Defense. They are exempt from this because they do a lot of practice, warfare, weapons practice, and things like that. And that, of course, as you can imagine, that can be detrimental to wildlife. It says on private lands, fines of 1 year possible imprisonment can be used to protect habitats of endangered species. But so that's a problem as well. It says critical habitats are supposed to be designated and protected by the Endangered Species Act. You can take a look at most of this. Number 5 is pretty important. It says there's controversy over the Endangered Species Act regarding the political and legal issue of whether federal and state governments should compensate owners for the decrease in the financial value of their property. So we go to the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment of eminent domain, which is the physical taking of land. And so the big controversy here in the last decade or so has been, well, if I have an endangered species on my property, can the government, using the Fifth Amendment, can they take control of my land? Can they regulate my land? Is this the same as the physical taking of land with eminent domain? But does the Fifth Amendment also go along with the regulatory taking of land? So this is something that we should be aware of. It says some developers, timber companies, and other private landowners avoid government regulations and loss of economic value by managing land to reduce its use by endangered species. So what has happened? What happened was people find loopholes in what they have to do. So if there is an endangered species on my property and therefore I'm going to be limited as to the activity I can do on my property because of the presence of that endangered species. Many people began to practice what was called the shoot, shovel, and shut up approach, and so this is sort of what we began to see happening. And so Congress changed the Endangered Species Act in several ways to help deal with the problems associated with regulatory taking issues, one being the shoot, shovel, and shut up solution, with what we call HCPs. You need to know what HCPs are: habitat conservation plans, designed to reach a compromise between the interests of private landowners and endangered and threatened species. The habitat, or the HCP, allows the destruction of some critical habitat or the killing of some members of a population if that landowner or that developer will take steps to protect the species, whether it be critical nesting sites or take away part of their land and protect it, or maintaining travel or habitat corridors to allow species to move in between. And so this is what we call a habitat conservation plan. This has worked somewhat, but then they found out once again that there were problems associated with this too, in that this often became sort of like trying to buy a car, and so you began to see people bargaining to see what they could do and what they couldn't do. It says HCPs are that one of the biggest problems was that they are approved without adequate scientific evaluation and their effects on the species, and that many are political compromises that do not protect the species or its recovery. So in 1999, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approved 2 new methods for protection of the species on private land. One was the Safe Harbor Agreement, and the other was the Voluntary Candidate Conservation Agreement. Both of these are examples of reconciliation ecology. Safe Harbor Agreement said that landowners would, if a landowner would voluntarily take steps to either restore, improve, or maintain habitat for a species, they would get technical help in return. So once again, they would actually could get some financial incentive to do this. The other was the Voluntary Candidate Conservation Agreement, which, if landowners agree to conserve a declining population that's not yet listed, in return, the landowner would not only receive financial help or technical help, but they would also have assurances that no additional restrictions would be imposed on their land. So, it's kind of like, I come in now and say, here's an animal that's probably going to be listed on the Endangered Species Act here in a couple of years. If you'll promise to do A and B, we'll never ask you to do anything else. But if you disagree with it, if you decline that opportunity, and then they come back in a couple of years and say, oh, you've got this endangered species, now you're going to have to do A, B, C, D, and E. And so those are 2 new things as in 1999 that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came up with, which is the Safe Harbor Agreement and the Voluntary Candidate Conservation Agreement, to modify the habitat conservation plans. It says efforts have been made to repeal or weaken the Endangered Species Act. Once again, these are in your notes. You can go over this yourself. And you need to just be familiar with why do people want to weaken it. Some say that it hasn't been successful, and some say it's that it's gone too far. If you look at reasons why some believe it should be strengthened, is because we see a greater rate of extinction because of human activities. Once again, one of the biggest arguments for the Endangered Species Act is number 3, is that almost 40% of the listed species, their numbers are now stable or improving. Think about one of our nation's icon, the bald eagle, has now been delisted from the endangered species list, and that's been that's a big success story. Okay. Now you notice, you see the $sign. We've talked about this earlier this year. If you look at, what are solutions to make the Endangered Species Act better? Well, we could spend more money. And so once again, that's a solution. Is it the best solution? You can decide for yourself on that. But once again, on the previous slide, it mentioned that how much the Department of Defense spends every hour. And so the money we're talking here would be, much, much smaller than that. But it is one solution you'll see throughout the course. It says most biologists believe the United States should modify the act to emphasize protection and maintenance of biologically diverse and ecological functioning rather than try to save individual species. If a species lives in an ecosystem in which the ecosystem is not functioning, the species most likely will not be able to survive. So this is the ecosystem approach here. Mimic nature, prevent rather than restore, money, ecological restoration. So here we're talking about, besides just the species, what can we do? Maintain a functional, diverse ecosystem is probably one of the best things we can do. And you can take a look at 1, 2, 3, and 4 there. Hotspots in the United States. I want you to write these down. These are the 6 top hotspots in the United States. Hawaii, the San Francisco Bay Area, Southern Appalachians, very close to us. If you look at the red there at number 3, right there is where I was raised, right there in the middle right side of that red circle. And that's where I told you that my dad had a farm that was bought by the Nature Conservancy. Death Valley, once again, in number 4 there. The Southern California area, and then the Florida Panhandle. These are our what we consider our 6 hotspots in the United States, areas where we have species that are endangered due to human activities mainly, or concentrations of rare species. Okay, right there is where I was. That's where the farm I was mentioned to you in class. Okay, what about flyways? Well, we've already learned what that is. Flyways are migratory migration patterns that birds have. And when we talk about the sanctuary approach, and we're going to protect these areas, we know the big one that we use is the National Wildlife Refuge System. There's 542 of these. They're mainly along the migratory flyways of migratory waterfowl. And these refuges have been mainly identified for waterfowl as well. Okay, it says about 1/5 of the United States endangered and threatened species have habitats in the refuge system, which makes the refuge system meaningful. Okay, it says human overuse by hunters, fishermen, off-road vehicles, and traffic hurt refuges. Look here, gene banks, botanical gardens, and farms. These are what we use to try to bring back these animals. Think about the black-footed ferret project. We're doing this with many different species. The black-footed ferret project, once again, the near extinction of the black-footed ferret was a case of unintended consequences, but we're seeing where we are making a difference. But what about plants? How do we preserve the biology? How do we preserve the genetics of a lot of our plants? And this is through seed gene banks. Down at the bottom, you'll see here some extra notes you probably need to write down. Seed gene banks are refrigerated environments with very low humidity. It says very few of these exist around the planet. They just opened one of the largest ones in Europe a few years ago. The storage space is probably inadequate. What are the dangers to this? Will the seeds that you store are not going to evolve? And so if we had to go back and get those seeds, would they be able to exist and survive in a changed environment at a later time? Some say yeah, some say that might be our only hope, or that sort of thing there. And also some seeds may not store well, and so that could be a problem with the genetics of some seeds. But this is one way we try to preserve biodiversity, is through our zoos, through our gene banks, botanical gardens, farms, captive breeding, and seed gene banks. Okay, one of the biggest problems with this, of course, is funding is generally inadequate. And what do we need to make with that? Money. So there's another example of what would be a solution to this would be to increase funding. Okay, so another thing, what do zoos do? Well, once again, the primary responsibility of zoos and aquarium are not to repopulate endangered species. They are to educate us and give us the appreciation and the knowledge of why these animals exist. Other things we do use are egg pulling, where we go out into the wild and we collect the eggs and hatch them in captivity and then release them to the wild. We've done this with many different species. Of course, captive breeding, once again, one of the big problems with captive breeding is that we don't have the facilities to create the numbers of organisms that we need to have a successful release. In the video I showed you about the black-footed ferret, it talked about how they were releasing some that had genetics that they weren't really that weren't that important because they weren't going to survive in the wild anyway. Their success rate in the black-footed ferret program is quite low. Artificial insemination is another big industry for livestock now, but now it may become a big industry for endangered species, where you can use surrogate mothers as incubators basically for these embryos. This was done in the cattle business since the 70s, and if I have time in class, I'll tell you about my uncle who actually was in the ground floor when they started doing this at Virginia Tech, but I don't have time to tell you here. But basically what it does is you basically take a fertilized embryo from a very desirable bull and a very desirable heifer, and you then flush that embryo or those multiple embryos out of the heifer. You freeze them, and then you basically insert those embryos into other types of cows that are good mothers, so to speak. And this is what they were doing even in the 70s. Now they're doing this sort of things like this, as you saw in the captive breeding program with the black-footed ferret. This is something that may be a solution, and to use a good technological optimist term here, for saving endangered species. But once again, the ultimate goal has to be the reintroduction of the species into the wild. It says reintroduction of endangered species to the wild may fail because there's not enough habitat. The individuals bred in captivity may not survive in the wild. And there may be renewed overhunting or capture of the returned species. Now, one of the things here that researchers are trying to avoid with number 2 is for instance, with the California condor. They feed them. They limit, even with the black-footed ferrets. They try to limit human interactivity or human interaction, where they use like puppets to feed the California condors, because if they don't learn to feed humans, then they're going to be in trouble. Also, what size of population do you need? You can see that in I. Look at J. It says the major conservation roles of zoos are to educate the public about the importance and the need to protect habitats. They generally don't have the space and necessary to sustain necessary numbers of a population. Here is a great segment from 60 Minutes on hunting endangered species. Can hunting endangered species protect them?
Where can you find some of the best big game hunting in the world? It's a place that may surprise you. Tonight we're going to take you on a journey into a world that many people don't even know exists.
The story will continue in a moment.
To get the best view, we flew by helicopter over this vast terrain. From the air, we could see herds of African antelope and zebra charging across the wide open spaces. It looks remarkably like Africa, but it's not. This is Texas. Here in the Lone Star State, the iconic Texas longhorn now shares the range with more than 250,000 animals from Asia, Africa, Europe. Today, Texas has more exotic wildlife than any other place on Earth.
How many exotics do you have in Texas?
I think our last count is there's like 125 different species here in Texas.
Charlie Seal is a fourth-generation rancher and the executive director of the Exotic Wildlife Association, based here in the heart of the Texas Hill Country. It's his job to represent the interests of some 5,000 exotic ranchers across North America.
So would you say Texas has the most non-native species of animals?
Yes, absolutely.
It's amazing that you had this really dramatic change in the Texas landscape going on, almost unnoticed by the rest of the country.
A lot of folks have noticed it, but it's been a well-kept secret.
It all began more than half a century ago with surplus animals from zoos. These images were filmed on Texas ranches back in 1975. The ranchers liked the novelty of these strange animals on their properties. But what started as a curiosity has evolved into a major achievement in wildlife conservation by helping to bring back 3 African antelope from the brink of extinction, according to Charlie Seal.
Our members own more numbers of rare and endangered species than any other association in the world. 3 of our biggest successes have been the scimitar horn oryx, the addax, and the dama gazelle. Our numbers have absolutely just skyrocketed in the last 15 to 20 years because of some...
These animals are thriving in Texas while they're still endangered or extinct in their native lands?
Yes.
So are they still endangered in your view?
Absolutely not. Not in Texas.
How did thousands of Texas ranches become home to the largest population of exotic animals on Earth? It's thanks to trophy hunters like Paul, who come here in the thousands to hunt these animals every year, sold on the idea of an African hunting experience in Texas. It's open season on close to 100 species of exotic game all the time here, because exotic animals are considered private property. Paul allowed us to come with him as he went on this hunt if we agreed to use only his first name.
I've been looking forward to this hunt for several months now, and I'm just pumped.
Here, he and a guide are searching for a scimitar-horned oryx for him to take home as a trophy. If they find one, it'll cost Paul $4,500. Other animals, like this dama gazelle, cost around $10,000. And the rarest, a Cape buffalo, has a $50,000 price tag. Exotic wildlife has become a billion-dollar industry in Texas, supporting more than 14,000 jobs. For 2 days, Paul and his guide searched this 30,000-acre ranch just 2 hours outside San Antonio for an oryx, but they didn't find any. Animal rights groups accuse the ranchers of making the hunts too easy, but that's not what we witnessed in this case. 6 months later, we met up with Paul when he came back to try his luck again on another ranch. We were curious to know whether it bothered him that the animal he was hunting is officially extinct in the wild.
Do you care about the species? Do you care if the species goes extinct? Does that mean anything to you?
Do.
Why do you want to kill them?
The money that I spend to hunt these animals keeps these animals alive on these ranches.
You may be surprised to learn that the U.S. government agrees with that. For years, it's allowed the scimitar-horned oryx and 2 other endangered antelope to be hunted on U.S. soil. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has concluded that hunting provides an economic incentive for ranchers to continue to breed these species, and that hunting reduces the threat of the species extinction. On ranches like this, they say they don't allow more than 10% of a herd to be hunted per year.
Here we go, guys.
After 6 hours, Paul and his guide have finally spotted some oryx. They were about 150 yards away, and they thought they'd found a suitable target. He got ready to take a shot.
Okay, is that the one? Sure?
Paul hit the target with 1 bullet.
Hunters are the main conservationists in this whole equation.
Can you call yourselves conservationists when, your purpose, your intent, the thing that's driving it is to hunt the animals and to kill them?
Absolutely. That's why these animals thrive, is because of that value that they have to the hunting community.
Just because people are willing to pay large amounts of money for those trophies doesn't make it right.
I can't let these animals just freely roam around my ranch. I can't do it. I won't do it.
Do you love these animals?
Absolutely.
How can you kill something you love?
I can do that for the simple reason that I know it's for the welfare of every one of those animals. That you sacrifice one so that many more are born and raised from calves all the way up to the big trophy male or the big trophy females that we have.
I think that's ludicrous. I think it's immoral, and I don't think anybody's entitled to do that.
Priscilla Farrell is president of Friends of Animals, an international animal rights organization. For the past 7 years, she's been fighting in court to stop these rare African antelope from being hunted in Texas.
They're breeding these antelopes, they're selling the antelopes, and they're killing the antelopes, and they're calling it conserving them. They're saying it's an act of conservation, and that's lunacy.
You would rather they did not exist in Texas at all?
I don't want to see them on hunting ranches. I don't want to see them dismembered. I don't want to see their value in body parts. I think it's obscene. I don't think you create a life to shoot it.
So if the animals exist only to be hunted,
right,
you would rather they not exist at all?
Not in Texas, no.
Our biggest enemy are the animal rights people. They don't understand what we do.
What's to understand? I mean, you're hunters and you hunt these exotic animals. That's pretty simple.
It is, but there are a faction of people out there that would just as soon see these animals go extinct as to have us use them to hunt. And after all, that is the bottom line. That's what these animals are all about. That's why they're here in the numbers that they're here today.
You're at the first place that this where it all began.
83-year-old Texan David Bamberger has spent more than 30 years fighting to save one of these antelope, the scimitar-horned oryx, from extinction. He brought us to where it all began, in this small pasture, which he calls the Sahara, on his 5,500-acre ranch.
Here they go.
Look at that. They're beautiful. Oh, look at the babies in the front.
You almost have to remind yourself that this is not Africa. It's Johnson City, Texas. This beautiful animal has horns that can grow as long as 4 feet and resemble the curved blade of a scimitar. It's believed by some to have inspired the myth of the unicorn.
They tell me it's the only African antelope known to be able to kill a lion.
They vanished decades ago from the deserts of Egypt, Senegal, Chad, all the places where they first walked the earth more than 2 million years ago.
They wouldn't be here and alive if we hadn't have taken some action 30 years ago.
In the late 1970s, Bamberger offered to devote more than 600 acres of his property to save an endangered animal at his own expense. American zoos sent him nearly all of the remaining known genetic stock of scimitar-horned oryx in the world, and from that he raised hundreds of animals. He's since sent some to African reserves for eventual reintroduction into the wild, but he believes the best hope to sustain the species today lies on the Texas range.
I've got ranches that I started them out on with a half a dozen animals that got 200 now.
But if you're a conservationist and you've given up your land, you've given up thousands, millions of dollars to save this species, yet you're not against hunting them?
Well, I wouldn't do it here. I'm not fond of it at all. But I'm wise enough, smart enough to know if there's no incentive, if altruism is the only incentive, you're not going to get a great deal of participation on someone whose livelihood depends on bringing in dollars.
You'd think you were in Africa.
Yeah.
Look at the giraffe sitting there.
We turn to one of the world's top conservationists, Pat Condy, who lives in Texas, to find out what he thought.
That's the scimitar-horned oryx. Altogether on different ranches, many different ranches, there's somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 of these animals.
Pat Condy has devoted his life to saving animals, and he showed us around the Fossil Rim Wildlife Center outside of Dallas, which he runs. It's a world leader in breeding rare and endangered animals. And it's also a place where tourists can get closer to these beautiful creatures than they ever could in the wild.
Do you think that Texas ranches are saving animals from extinction?
There's no question about it, that they are.
What gives you the confidence to say what you're saying?
What gives me the confidence is when you look at the numbers, the animal numbers, okay? And you see that they're not declining, that they're either stable or growing.
The numbers, you can't argue with that.
When you're talking about conservation, it's the numbers that are the bottom line.
But for Priscilla Farrell, the bottom line is that these animals should not be hunted. She's helped create a reserve in Senegal for 175 oryx, and in court, she's winning the legal battle she's been fighting for years to stop them from being hunted in the U.S. In the coming weeks, a new rule issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will take effect, making it a crime to hunt the scimitar-horned oryx and 2 other endangered antelope without a federal permit. That will be difficult, if not impossible, to obtain.
Just since the announcement of that rule, the value of those animals have probably dropped in half. You got to understand, I'm a rancher to make a profit, just like any business.
How does this rule change affect that?
I will say that in 5 years, you'll see half the numbers that you see today. And I would venture to guess in 10 years, there will be virtually none of them left.
The future for oryx is Africa. It's not Texas.
Can the future not be both? Don't they have a greater chance of survival the more of them there are?
In their native lands.
Regardless of where they are.
I don't think you can say regardless of where they are. A Texas hunting ranch is not the same as being in a reserve in Senegal.
Put the hunting aspect to one side and take a 50,000-foot view over this. This resource of the species that is extinct in the wild is going to disappear now from Texas, slowly but surely.
So who's winning the day here?
I don't think anybody's winning the day. One thing is for sure, they are losing it. Those species are losing it.
Well, that gives you something to think about. If you think whether you're pro-hunting or you're anti-hunting, that's a compelling argument for to show us that incentives do work to get people to act in certain ways. And so I just thought that was an excellent story to show you, and I hope you did enjoy that. This is a picture. Once again, we're finishing up the chapter of the different flyways that we see. And remember, what are located along these flyways? This is where we find, especially in North America, where we find a lot of our wildlife refuges to protect animals. The last thing is reconciliation ecology. We've already learned this back in chapter 11. Look at the bold print. It is the science of inventing and establishing and maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity where people live out their lives, or as I told you in the last chapter, where we live, work, and play. Examples of reconciliation ecology, we talked about the habitat conservation plans, or the changes in them with the voluntary candidate conservation program, but also, like, remember we talked about bluebird boxes. Building bluebird houses and putting them on the campus would be an example of reconciliation ecology. Last, once again, it says there are several ways to implement this. Bluebird project, as I said, rooftop gardens, which here at the Career Center we do have a green roof, which we could use to bring in certain species. We could put a beehive up there, for instance. We can use native plants in our yards, and so many different things we can do. And once again, what can you do? You can take a look at this. You know, don't buy exotic plants and things like that. Of course, the fur industry is not what it used to be. Of course, ivory products are illegal globally to purchase. And so, once again, that, folks, is the end of the chapter. So, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sorry it was too long. I'll try to break this up into several segments, so hopefully that will be the case. Thank you, and good night.